I'm Paul Sullivan, your host on the Company of Dads podcast, where we explore the sweet, sublime, strange, and silly aspects of being a lead dad in a world where men, who are the primary parents, often feel they have to hide or at least not talk about their roles. Today, on the Company of Dads podcast, I'm talking to Hanson Lee, the founder of Daddilife, a parenting website for dads in the United Kingdom. I came across it while reading about him and a colleague in the Harvard Business Review, right here, if you guys want to get it. He wrote about dads building what he calls parenting allies at work, and I wanted to know more. Hanson, welcome.
Thanks very much for having me on, Paul.
How did it start? How did you start Daddilife?
So Daddilife started about 6.5 years ago when my own son, who's now 7, was very, very young. And I knew at the time, I wanted to be a very different father to what I had growing up. But everywhere I looked, there were a great number of dad blogs. And I think what I kind of termed dad diary content, following different dads on their journey. And that was great, but it felt like there was a missing piece around a more collective shift in fatherhood as a whole and the generational shift of fatherhood. And it just felt like there was a missing piece for that. So as ever with many of these things, you kind of create the solution to your own problem.
Yeah.
And it's grown over the last few years to be certainly the UK's largest content platform. We've become a 2-time best-selling author, and we also run a consultancy for DE&I for dads at work that you briefly referred to before.
Yep. Yeah. What were you doing before you started Daddilife?
So my background's actually in marketing and HR. So I actually led one of what is still, I think, one of the largest rebrand programs in the UK. With quite a large retailer here in the UK called the Cooperative. Worked across sort of CRM, social media, various different platforms for the likes of Bacardi, Unilever, and a few others. But I've also done a lot of employer brand. So lots around the HR lifecycle, and also a huge base of my role in careers has been in research, which is why we've done so much of it at Daddilife.
Yeah. Please tell me, please promise me this, Hanson. Please promise me, when you were working in HR, please tell me you weren't the guy who said, no, you can't take paternity leave.
No, I didn't. I didn't get. Unfortunately, I didn't even have the big red button for that. It's funny actually, because in a way we're kind of putting hopefully the big green button now of that across many organisations in the UK. Excuse me, frog in the throat. But it is interesting, and I think the US perspective is so interesting for me, particularly because actually there's still so much to do. I think particularly from a US standpoint, and hopefully we can talk about that a little bit more today as well.
Talk to me about that. When you think about, you started this, 7 years ago, you said 6.5, so like 2016 or so. What was your goal then, and what was the landscape like in the UK for dads and working dads?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think that there has been a lot of progress, I'd say, over the last few years, particularly in the UK, where when I think back to what it was relatively one-dimensional at that point. And what I mean by that is it was very much a social media platform. We did a lot around the community, but kind of in a broader sense in terms of funny anecdotes, life lessons, quotes, things that would crowd that daily interaction. But actually, I guess where it's evolved to over recent years is as dads, I think, have become more present, and I think we've become more aware as a society of the role of dads. That's not to say there isn't a heck of a long way to go, still there is, but I think there is definitely this groundswell that's starting to emerge for dads at home. And actually we did a big piece of research on that in the UK, which I'll send through after this, called the Dad Index, which is actually where we measured and actually really got to the nitty gritty of, so we say dads are more involved, which is great, but actually how exactly are they more involved? Like, is it certain routines? Is it certain responsibilities? Or what is it? And so that Data Index report actually was the first time we deep dived into buying behavior, its relationship to roles, routines at home, but actually just the kind of more proof in the pudding of what dads are actually doing. And I think what we're seeing though is that while dads are doing more at home and they're on the journey to becoming more of that equalized parent, or as you would say, more of that lead dad, there is still a massive weight of disappointment, I would say, when it comes to the dads at work experience, where culturally there is still this overarching thought and belief that dads should just be at work. And I think you see that time and time again in organizational culture, whether that's around, as you said, paternity leave, whether that's around flexible working, whether that's around sort of challenging what men do
Yeah.
around here. And I think it's so often that we hear from other dads about them challenging that status quo and then being given, the grunt work or being put on the B track, so to speak. And I think
Yeah.
that's where a lot of our work is focused on, actually sort of saying, well, one, through research. So we did quite a big report with Deloitte in 2019 called The Millennial Dad at Work, which we do refer to a little bit in the article, where it was the first time we were able to just really deep dive into dads at work and their actual day-to-day experiences of work, whether that be through policy, whether that be through tensions with colleagues or line managers or wider arrangements as a whole. I think the big call-out stat for me from that research, we interviewed just over 2,000 working dads in there, is 33% of all the dads that we interviewed had actually left their roles since becoming a dad in order to actually find this better work-life integration.
And when you say
another
left their roles,
third,
were they doing it, taking a different career, or they're taking a step in a different direction within their company? What did it mean exactly?
so leaving the company, so a totally different role and a totally different organization, because they didn't feel supported as a
Yeah.
dad at work in that organization. So that was already a significant base of people. But what was interesting was that another third on top of that were actively looking.
Mm.
And so what you've got is a state where 66%, 2/3 of this group of people who will be colleagues, junior managers, senior managers, they'll be vital talent in an organization in some level of flux. And I think, one thing we predicted from that research is that this isn't a thing that will gradually be seen and felt in organizations. It will be a cliff edge. And I think one thing we've seen over COVID is that it has been a cliff edge.
Yeah.
It's here. It's here now, because we probably haven't been as busy as we have over the last 12 months on that side of the organization, because there's so much that organizations are now seeing dads leaving their organizations in droves and going, hey, we need to do something about this. What's going on?
Yeah, when I talk to companies over here, it's exactly what I say is that, your high performers are going to get up and leave, whether they are, working moms, and you're not, sort of meeting them where they need to be met, or they're dads, working dads who are, at least in the States, are afraid to say, hey, I need some time to be a parent, because they're afraid to say it, because if they do, they think they're going to get dinged and seen as not committed to work, as you just said. But it's like those high performers are the ones who have the ability to say, I've had enough. I don't want to do this anymore. I can get another job over here. They're going to let me do it. And we've been, I'm sure over there, we're talking a lot about quiet quitting here in the States, where people are doing just the sort of the bare minimum. And I think, I want to say to companies, like, you should kind of welcome that, because the other part of, if these people who are quiet quitting, maybe they're not your top performers, but at least they're still there. They're going to have other people who are just going to out and out quit and say, I don't. And I have all these examples from different dads, from different working moms who've gone from, XYZ, platinum company that is grinding them to be in the office, 4 or 5 days a week and has no flexibility, to, 1, 2, 3, newer startup-y company that pays them just as well, gives them more flexibility, and they're taking those skills and they're leaving. And, it's a real, problem. Have you noticed when your research, you talk about this cliff edge, but in your research, you started in 2016, completely different world for working parents in general. We go through 2020, 2021, now here we are in 2022. What have you seen as some of the bigger, changes that are coming out of this, either from the millennial dads that you surveyed back then, or dads in general in the UK? How has it changed? I guess we call it post-pandemic, but, as I think about work.
It's interesting. I think in the UK, we talk about the next normal.
The next normal. That's what
the next normal,
okay.
Yeah. And this next normal phase is really interesting, because in a way, it's obviously a byproduct of the new normal that was its predecessor before. I kind of always think about Star Wars, and this is like, how many prequels can you get in here, guys? Do I need to ring up Hayden Christensen again? But the thing that's interesting, obviously, about new normal is its benefits in terms of dads at work specifically, is that it opened up more of the possibility of what could be, I think, for more and more men and more dads at work specifically. And I think I always say modern day fatherhood isn't really an age thing. It's very much an attitude thing. And what's so interesting about it is it definitely opened up new possibilities, and I think started to break through some of those traditional barriers. But what's interesting is, as ever with this new or next normal, this sense of actually going back to the way things were is something that I think organizations are now struggling with, in that you've now got, if you think about it, the last 2 years, let's call it 2 years, 18 months, 24 months, you've got this group of men, particularly in the UK, I've seen this, more firsthand, where they've not known anything else but working from home while they've had a newborn.
Oh, sure.
And
Yeah.
so when you think about that, then to actually trying to convince that group of colleagues, that group of, as you said, valuable talent, that actually going back to the office is really a great thing. Where they're like, well, no, actually, I've had a chance to do the things that I never ever would have had an opportunity of doing as
Mhm.
consistently as I have for the last 2 years. Why would I want to go back to the way things were? And I think there is
Right.
this real
And
tension at
they
the
and
moment.
they've shown that, look, I was able to perform at a high level. I was able to get things done that you
Absolutely.
asked me to get
Absolutely.
done. And I always say, like, if you were on a very important client call from, say, 3:30 to 4:30 in the afternoon, which is when, my kids come home from school here outside of New York City. If you're on a very important client call, you wouldn't hang up because somebody at work was calling you. You would finish that very important client call, and then you'd call the person back. And I think, like, we need to sort of, as working dads, say, okay, this is that hour in which I'm going to have that fresh time with the child. When they just get
Yeah.
off the bus, all their stories are there. They want to tell you about their day. You wait 2 hours to dinner. What happened at school? Nothing. Nothing at all. Nothing. Really? Nothing. But you get them off the bus and it all comes out. Like, I had art today. I love my history. I got a new teacher, this and this. Johnny got gum stuck on his shoe. All this stuff comes out, and it's pure gold. But I feel we need to, sort of advocate for companies to realize that, an hour in your calendar openly, we're talking about this openly, we're not hiding it. To do that makes you a better human. And it makes
Yes.
you, and if you're a better human, you're going to be a better human at work.
So something we talk about is about how dads can bring their dad identity to work more visibly, because that visibility of, you're not just known, as you said, for doing X, Y, Z. You're not just a colleague. You're also a dad, or you're also a carer. You're something else beyond work, but that actually impacts your work, whether hopefully in a positive way.
Mm-hmm.
And I think being more intentional with that identity is so, so important. And it's why, in the article we talk about allyship, because certainly in the UK, about 72% of the whole UK workforce is a parent or carer. I think in the US, it's about 62, 63%, or something
Depends on the
around that.
region, but yeah. Some are
Yeah,
higher than others. Yep.
yeah, kind of a federal level. So you've got a significant population and a significant weight of GDP right there in terms of, these roles and responsibilities, not just at work but beyond. And I think that's why allyship for me is such an important part of this next normal. And it's not something that I think a lot of people, or not enough people, are really leaning into. In that, so often people think dads at work is a dad's thing, and it is obviously as an individual, but actually getting the right kind of balance and equity as a dad at work is fundamentally about the whole family,
A hundred
because it's
percent.
about unlocking real gender equality throughout the whole family and actually making sure the family can thrive. And that's why something we do in the UK, we're piloting it with 3 organizations at the moment, is we actually run a dad mentoring program. But so the first round of it, we actually matched external dad mentors to internal dad mentors. And we tried to get that sense of fresh perspective in those safe
Mm.
spaces. What we learned very quickly, actually, was that organizations were a little bit fearful of that. They weren't comfortable with that lack of visibility and that slight lack of transparency. Understandable. So what we do now is we actually empower the organization to essentially run a dad specific mentoring program. And the results have been absolutely transformational, because for
So
us,
are the dads coming from within that company,
from within,
XYZ
yeah,
Bank? Okay. How does that work though?
exactly.
But how does that work? Because, I mean, one of the things that I think, at least here, that change is going to start more in the middle, more, what we call middle managers. Nobody wants to call that. So call them emerging managers, because they're closer to the people they work with. If you have somebody, and this is obviously you thought this through, so I'm giving you an opportunity to explain it, but, like, if you have a dad who's been super successful and hasn't struck that balance, in behavioral economics, we call that an anchoring bias. They're going to think that their way of doing it is the way that works. And it often happens for very senior female executives as well, who have succeeded without, mentors and all this, and then to ask them to go back. And so how are you finding, the right match of men at work who are dads who have been sufficiently successful balancing this? They have to be sufficiently successful to be a model. Otherwise you're like, well, this guy's not done this well at all, So walk me through, or walk us through how that works.
So essentially, I'm a massive proponent of behavioral economics. So that a large part of my marketing role before this was based around that. And I think we kind of use similar principles of not so much anchoring, but more nudge behavior.
Mm-hmm.
In that, the thing that's interesting with the mentoring is, you're right, you definitely need someone who has a certain level of visibility and a certain level of seniority. But fundamentally, this is actually a kind of two-way process, in that what we do first is we recruit a very specific profile of mentor who has to be within a certain recency of being a dad himself. Because actually one of the tensions, as you know, I'm sure, is there's a generational tension between, what I kind of call, perhaps wrongly, boardroom dad, who may be a little bit detached, maybe wasn't as present a father, whether through fault of his own or not, but circumstances dictated that maybe there is a certain detachment there, versus, as you were saying, this kind of emerging middle management father, very active, very present, slightly different roles, responsibilities, outlooks, on things in terms of work and family. And so we're very, very conscious really about recruiting the right type and profile of mentor, but we work very, very closely with HR teams and D&I teams then around actually, how do we get the dads, the mentees? Because the mentees are not those necessarily who are just new fathers. It's also the ones who are dads to be. And I think where we've seen real success is how we can grow not just necessarily a relationship, but a bit of a community internally. Because what happens is that, so for instance, if we have 12 mentors and 12 mentees this year, that then doubles. So that actually what you're creating is a sustainable culture of change, because then in year 2, you've now got potentially 24 mentors. The next year you've got, more and more and more.
Yeah.
So what you're doing is creating this pretty rapid change from the inside, but with a new generation who are kind of taking ownership of it, obviously with the right steers from ourselves. But we partner with a mentoring organization called the Parent Mentor as well. So we've kind of got the best of both worlds in terms of deep mentoring expertise, but also, dad specific focus.
Yeah, I can understand why you'd want to get this sort of dad to be. There's sort of a tabula rasa. They don't have any good or bad dad behaviors. They don't, know what it's like to be a dad at work. They just know what it's like to be somebody at work, and then somebody who's with a partner at work. But what do you do? How do you sort of work with the fathers who say have, as you do, you said, have a 7-year-old, I have a 5, 10, and 13, but who know a different world of work, that world of work, before COVID, before we're able to work from home, but also, having to juggle things and things. Life for dads, life for working parents has changed tremendously in the past decade. But to be quite honest, people have scars. People are scarred from, trying things at work as a working parent, a lead dad, a working mom, and it didn't work, didn't go well. So how do you help them realize, okay, this time is different. The company is honestly trying to work with you, and this is a positive. So put yourself out there.
Yeah, I think there's probably more than one question in that question, which is, I think, one, what's the process around making sure that actually you're getting the right sort of engagement and possibly the right kind of openness? Because I think one thing is, and I think of myself kind of, this is very sort of masculine behavior as well, is, I don't think it's controversial to say we're not always the best at being truly open at work, as men, because we're kind of fearful about the consequences of those things. So I think part of your question is also about process in terms of real openness, because, as you know, with any sort of good mentoring relationship, the real transformation is how you can actually genuinely be open about where you want to go, and actually how quickly and how openly you can embrace that transformation. But there's also a second part of that, which is, I think, in your question, which is also about how do you ensure not just that the process is right and the openness is right, but actually how are you kind of getting, this is not quite the right word, but how are you getting the buy-in, I guess, from a sort of organizational perspective too. So if I sort of take part one, we run quite specific mentor training as part of the program, and that is really, really important for us because actually it's not necessarily just showing up as a coach, as a mentor, as someone who's just there to be a sounding board. There is a different role that you bring to it as a dad mentor, which is not just the world of work. It's kind of the world at home and the world of
Sure.
dad at work. And so we're very intentional, and that training is very specific for that particular role. And as part of that, we're already kind of growing this sense of community and this dad community. And one of the exercises we run in that first workshop is about their own dad journeys. So we're very intentional about dads opening up themselves with other dads in a safe environment
Yeah.
around, what was your own journey? And it's amazing that we hear from dads who have had more conventional journeys, but have also, had miscarriages along the way, have gone through IVF, have had dads of twins or triplets unexpectedly, have kind of really faced a lot of roller coasters, as you know, kind of day-to-day parenting
Yeah.
life
Yeah. Yeah.
is, but are very intentional about it. And actually, those sessions are some of the best sessions we have, even right at the start, because there is a level of openness that dads and men and organizations have just never been able to be as open as that in a pretty, safe environment. But not just to be open, but actually to be useful with that information as well for other colleagues.
When I was, doing research on the idea for the company of dads, I just had this feeling that men weren't going to be open with me about their role as the lead dad, as a primary parent. And so instead, I went and talked to a lot of senior female executives at professional services firms, at law firms, because I had the sense like, okay, how did you find, balance? How did you find somebody to help out? How did you do it? And I had this hunch that, sure, some people could make enough money and have a lot of paid caregivers, but that's not a lot of people. And some people could have family helping out over here, but that's not a lot of people. I figured there had to be something in the middle. And it was talking to these senior female executives who said, yeah, my husband and I, we either he's the lead dad or we've traded off over time with, me being the lead mom, he being the lead dad, depending on how our careers were going. And they were much more, open in talking about,
Yeah.
this role. And that's, I mean, one of the things we're trying to do at the company of dads is to normalize this, that this is just,
Yes.
we have this incredible moment. Let's not, squander it. Let's say like, okay, we can do things differently. The senior most management may be saying we need to return and work like we used to, but the reality is they can say that all they want. People can vote with their feet. People can vote in the quiet quitting movement, and we need to acknowledge, companies need to acknowledge that it has to be different. It's not that this time is different. It's like people are demanding that they want to switch from as somebody told me, a sort of means based economy to a meaning based economy.
I think you're totally right. I think there's something there about it. We're definitely accelerating to this, but it still feels like a juncture, and a juncture where we can go left or right in terms of, we can try and struggle on, and we can try and wrap people up into various different ways of going back to the way things were, or we can actually embrace a new world. And it doesn't even necessarily need to be totally one or the other. It can be kind of the best of both. But I think at the moment there are still too many, I would say, certainly in the UK, organizations and kind of more traditional leadership that is anchoring towards that initial route of saying, well, okay, COVID's over. We don't have to wear the masks as much. Let's get back to it. And it's like, well, no, because you haven't really been listening or aware of actually how people have changed through
Right.
this. And the people have changed tremendously.
Let's talk a little bit more about the depth and breadth of the parenting ally network at work. Obviously, mentorship, I can see this being part of it. But when as you fleshed it out in the HBR piece, how do you see it, starting out? You got some baby steps, just kind of like kids. And how do you see it, flourishing at the companies that really allow it to flourish?
So there's part of the answer, and that's the start of the answer, kind of goes back to what you were saying before in terms of what about those people who maybe have stepped above their parapet before and been scarred by it. And one thing we always say to people is actually you are to a certain degree responsible for the change in your environment, and I'm a big proponent of that. And I think one of those very small steps that actually starts a wider movement of allyship for anyone is actually just being a lot more intentional with your identity as a parent. So where I've seen this happen, and I've seen this happen in three steps time and time again, is people are more intentional with their identity, and I know that sounds like quite a big structured thing. To be honest with you, Paul, it's as simple as just talking about what you were up to with the kids at the weekend.
Right.
Those water cooler
Because
moments,
people are talking
physically
about
or
other things
physically.
anyway. They're talking about, hey, this past
Yeah,
weekend I played football with my buddies. This past weekend I played golf with my buddies. This past weekend my partner and I went out to dinner. That part of their identity is already being discussed at the proverbial
absolutely,
water cooler. So why not add in the other stuff? And I'd
absolutely.
say add it in, honestly, not the glory moments of, little Johnny scored 2 goals this weekend. It's the whole richness of being a parent, which isn't always filled with glory moments.
I couldn't agree more. Like, be totally transparent. I mean, for me anyway, as transparent as you feel comfortable. But I would say for any dad, or mum listening, certainly being authentic is saying with actually your own journey of parenthood and actually probably sharing some of those challenges. One can do two, can actually be amazed at how many answers and how many helpful insights can come back your way sometimes. But also, it just lets other people know that, okay, do you know what? This person is something beyond just what I think of them. Actually, they've got some challenges, some tensions, some opportunities in this other part of their life that actually is either impacting negatively or positively, sometimes both, their role at work. And where I've seen that move to is then stage two, which is actually how you then start to form what I call sort of informal community.
Mm.
So starting not just to talk about your own identity as a parent at work, but listening out for others who are saying it. Because it's amazing how sometimes you think of someone, who works across the hallway here or is on another end of a Slack message here. But as soon as you overlay their life with that parenting equity that you both share, suddenly actually being able to pick up that line and go, "Ooh, have you thought about this?" Or, "Hey, notice you said this the other day. I thought this could help." Or actually, maybe there's a wider thing here that we can actually talk about and actually connect
Mhm.
on. And that's actually part of the third phase, which is then when those sort of informal threads become something a little bit bigger and a little bit more formal. And so in the UK, we've been working with a lot of organizations around either a sort of dad specific network in their organization or a working parent network, which for
Wow.
us is kind of the bigger epiphany if they're ready for it. And I think time and time again, I've seen, and this is kind of my what do you call it? My kind of burned fingers experience, which is where you sometimes work with organizations who think they're ready for a working parent network, but all they're really ready for is the badge of it because it makes them look good and feel good. But actually, there isn't much substance behind that.
Right.
I think the true epiphany, and I've seen this, so, one good example of this is we've worked with them before, like John Lewis, who are quite a large retailer here in the UK. I'm just trying to think who they're sort of comparable to. They're not a target, but they're kind of it'll come to me. They're just a very lovely
Yeah.
organization as well. And they've got a working parent network that is truly equitable and equal in terms of the issues they talk about, both for mum, dad, carers as a whole. And I think as well, the way you arrive at parenting can be very diverse, not just necessarily traditional couples. You've obviously got, even same-sex dads and other sort of various roles and formations of what modern day family look and feel like. They are excellent at actually understanding that their working parent network isn't just a badge, it isn't just a club, it isn't just a
Mhm.
network. It's fundamentally about another part of your identity as a parent that we can talk it very openly, whether you're mum, whether you're dad, whether you're
Yeah.
a carer, however you're coming at it. So they do it incredibly successfully. And they also have a equal parenting program. So dads that you can take up to, I think it's 24 weeks now of
Wow.
paid leave.
Wow. Did companies ever push back and worry, at least in the UK, about liability they may face for this? And by that I mean, it's all well and good. You have parenting network, you have a working dads network, or any group of this, and people are talking and sharing about themselves, their kids. But what if people are really struggling? What if they're struggling, around the strain of it? Sometimes, again, start certain moments of a year, you got a lot going on with your kids, and they're having, we're more open about talking about mental health struggles now, but not super open. I mean, do they worry that, okay, if something gets said in that group, we now have an obligation to deal with it, and it's not just a group of people sharing how they balance their
Yeah.
different parts of their person?
You're absolutely right. And I think this is where the kind of behavior of a group is so important, because it's great that we might have a badge that says Working Parent Network, but actually, if we're just listening and we're kind of just inviting the good stuff and we're not taking action on the actual real stuff that actually could be really, really crap, then actually all we are is just a glorified, pat on the back, for people, and that's not really going to
Right.
help
And then
anyone.
people who are already feeling alone feel even more alone or lonelier than they
Exactly.
were before.
And I think that's why, whether it's our mentoring program or the other networks that we've been involved in, there is always a really embedded behavior to, at the very, very least, signpost someone. So signpost someone, sometimes that's to the HR business partner, sometimes that's someone more senior, sometimes that's someone totally different. But actually being action-based is the key ingredient to these groups, because otherwise it just becomes, as you said, another very surface level forum. So I think where I've seen it work really well is where they go deep and where they're very intentionally action based.
Hanson Lee, thank you for being my guest today on the Company of Dads podcast. A little bit lighter, last question for you. What are you most optimistic about over the next, 12 months for dads at work?
That's a huge question. What am I most optimistic about? I am most optimistic, I think, about dads starting. So one thing that I think I've always been quite envious, I must admit, of working mums of, is that all the great working mums I know, and I include my own in this, are really just incredible human beings, first of all, but have this incredible behavior of being almost create self sorority around themselves and around their networks. And it's a great way of sort of lifting people up through really, really troubled times. Men and dads generally do not have that same behavior. Far from it. In fact, I think there's a lot more natural inclination to be a lone wolf and almost to suffer in silence than to open up. I am optimistic that, and maybe I'm just putting a lot of pressure on you here, Paul, but I am optimistic that more networks will form that actually gets us out of that lone wolf mentality and into something a bit more open, a bit more engaging, a bit more, dare I say, honest about the people we are and the people we want to be. And I'm optimistic about it, because if you'd asked me the same question a year ago, I wouldn't have said this, but I'm starting to see a few dots around different organizations, different people, I think more importantly, different HR people as well in organizations gravitating towards that question themselves. So I'm optimistic that even though the base may be small, there'll be some impact. But maybe you can ask me again in 12 months and see if that's right or totally wrong.
We'll come back. We'll revisit it then. Thank you again, Hanson Lee, founder of Daddilife. I really appreciate this conversation today.
Thanks. Same here, Paul.